thanks for having me. I'll be presenting my work on that from my lab at UMass Lowell in the US and my co-PI Mario at Uppsala University in Sweden, talking about investigating buzz pollination using micro-robotic shakers and pollen release. So first, a brief intro to buzz pollination. What is that? It's a means of pollination in which the pollen is encased in an anther cone and can only be released when it's vibrated at high frequency. This is done by numerous bee species, but almost no other pollinators, and many plant species have this. We may hear a buzz. Yes, there we go. So that's the flight sound, and then right after, those higher pitch buzzes are the buzzes that it uses to pollinate when it locks its wings in place during those. So we came at this project. I'm a roboticist, and my colleague is a biologist, and we wanted to brought together this interplay where, in my work, we have a lot of bio-inspired design. We study insects and other organisms, learn from them either with kind of biomimicry, like in this photo, or to learn lessons for developing other kind of engineering devices. But on the other side, by making mechanical devices to mimic aspects of animal behavior, they are much more controlled experiments, easier to model, and we can use those to gain behavioral insights for the organism. And that's the focus of this HFSP grant. So there's been many things we've been looking at. One I'll talk about today is why do bees buzz intermittently? So you heard those sounds where it wasn't a continuous buzz, but rather little pulses. It turns out that actually happens across several different time scales. Do we have a pointer? Yeah. Right. So you see these different time scales of the bee visiting the flower or not visiting, buzzing and not buzzing when it's on the flower, and then even when it's buzzing, it sometimes is biting the anther and sometimes not biting. That aspect we studied extensively earlier in the grant, where we looked at high-speed videos of the bees and did motion tracking, where you can see what we found that what actually is happening is the bee is using its head as an amplifier when it vibrates its thorax, but whether it bites or doesn't bite the anther in a moment should come up. We'll get a much bigger motion of the anther when it's biting versus not biting. So there it's not biting. It still bobbles its head in tune with its thorax muscle contraction, but then when it bites the anther, it transfers that vibration much more effectively to the anther. So that is a interesting behavior, and later I'll talk about robotic versions that we're developing for that. But another important question is, why do bees exhibit this intermittent buzzing to begin with? We can't tell the bees to behave differently. Maybe we can try to do this, mimic this behavior with a robotic version. So these were kind of the first version of these devices. That the idea is that they're a similar mass range to a real bee and can actually sit on the flower as opposed to traditional external shakers. These just are a beam of material that bends back and forth when you apply an electric field. And we made these at several different sizes. Show a couple here. We can control the frequency and the amplitude. And here's just showing that vibrating on a tomato flower at 300 hertz, releasing pollen. Whoops, sorry. So the idea of this experiment that is under review is that we would affix these little devices with wire legs to the anther, and then collect the pollen and see what happens if we make this vibration continuous, as shown in the solid blue bars here, versus in a series of separated pulses. And it turns out that we actually got a very strong effect where pollen release was quite a bit greater with periodic buzzing than with continuous buzzing. And we saw this effect across at least 5 different flower species, so it was quite a robust effect, despite a lot of variation in nature, of course. Then we wanted to also check what would have happened if we used a traditional shaker. And we also observed this effect. We think that this actually strengthens the evidence that this would be happening in real bees, because while neither of these ways of trying to mimic bee behavior is exactly the same as a real bee, they're very different from each other. We'll get into that in a moment. The other thing we found was that the robobuzzers elicit less pollen release than the mechanical shaker, That makes a lot of sense from what we were thinking about going into this grant, which is that the boundary conditions are very different from the way it's been usually studied. A mechanical shaker is affixed to a single point on the anther. It is much heavier and stiffer than the anther, so it's basically unaffected by the anther. The anther will just move in exactly the same way as the shaker. Whereas for a real bee, it sits on the anther. It's not directly coupled to it in any way. And we think that's a little bit closer with this kind of system, especially the case where the bee is not biting the anther. So the anther motion can be different from the robot's motion. And experiments are ongoing to look at the frequency response of these kind of systems, where we think we'll see a lot of interesting effects. So, that tells us some reason why bees might buzz intermittently, because if they can get more pollen for the same energy, obviously that would be a benefit. But we still don't understand what is the physical causes on the pollen release side inside the anther. What about an anther would make this happen? So for that, we turned to simulations. These are led by my grad student. The idea being that we would like to be able to turn on and off various physical effects, governing particle interactions, what is the shape of the anther, how is it moving, how many pollen grains are there, and so forth. And we came up with a whole table of different possible parameters to vary to try to understand what's going on, and calculated it would take 70 years to run all of these. So for now, I'm just going to, we'll try to get some more computation power, but I'm just going to show you a couple of preliminary comparisons, little slices through this space. So we don't have any groundbreaking conclusions yet. Let's see, we'll play these. So this is just showing an example of some of these kind of simulations. People have done simulations before, but we wanted to kind of broaden the spectrum of what kind of parameters we're varying. So here we're looking at a trapezoidal shape as opposed to a rectangle that's often used, because actually real anthers tend to get narrower at the tip. And we're also looking at is there a difference between rotating the anther versus translating. In reality, we see many complicated combinations of these kind of motions. So we'll just step through some of the curious things that we're seeing is with a trapezoidal shape, if you just translate it back and forth, it has an effect of driving the pollen grains inward rather than expelling them. It still does expel pollen grains because there's a big diffusion of the random particles interacting with each other. When they hit the wall, if it's on an angle and you're just translating it, it tends to drive them in. And we see this effect more if we're just translating versus if you rotate, then that's not going to be as prominent. And in fact, if we rotate at a larger angle that's getting close to the angle of the walls, then we see the opposite effect where even that kind of drift force is pushing them outward. Again, these kind of preliminary results using a spring damper model for the pollen interactions, which is not including stickiness. So we try to look at, first we have gravity. If we have the anther pointed where the pore opening is at the top, it seems to tend to accumulate the particles at the bottom pretty quickly. But again, we have to be careful when we look at this huge multidimensional space, what general conclusions can we draw, because this may well also be affected by how many pollen grains there are. There are not that many in this case, so there will be less particle interactions. Gravity has more time to pull them down. And then if we include stickiness in the model, that's this JKR model, then we get more driving in. And if we make a more realistic 200,000 pollen grains in there, it actually made an even steeper driving in force there. So these are still things we're trying to explore. We don't have any clear answers yet on that. But here's just showing the difference if you have the realistic number of pollen grains. It takes a lot longer to run other simulations. Back to the question we were talking about earlier, intermittent versus continuous. So far, if we just have a spring damper model for interaction and small number of pollen grains, we're not seeing this effect. So the idea, somehow didn't display very well on here, but basically the change in pollen release corresponds to the duty cycle and not any benefit to having the intermittent vibration. But we expect that as we make more realistic models in the simulations, we will eventually identify what is the dominant cause. For example, here's a very realistic shape of anther that is scanned in. Okay, so now the last part of the topic is, back earlier on I said we had the head motion of the bee that was bobbling in tune with its body. We want to be able to mimic that with a robotic version so we can change all of the properties more controllably. So the idea being, we would make some kind of device like this that also has a head that amplifies the motion of its body, and maybe we can learn other aspects. For example, we don't yet know whether it's something purely kinematic, like the way the wings might be. Every contraction of the thorax muscle pulls the wings back and forth in a fixed way. We think it's not that, but or it could be purely passive. The body vibrates, passively transmits the vibration. So we want to tease out what that looks like with a robotic system. And we had made a bunch of versions like this a while back, which look cool in the video, but unfortunately they had buckling in these joints that we're calling the shoulders that provide the amplification. So if we actually tried to move something with the tip, those joints would buckle. So we make a new version, 2.1, and not only resolving that issue, but we really wanted to make it very easy to interchange different parts so that we can explore parameter space beyond what we would observe in the real insects to try to determine whether a given thing is optimal. So we want to look at head orientation. Bees change that. Here we're just going to pop off and on different heads. What about the amplification ratio? The bees aren't changing that, but we can put in different values to see if the value that the bees are using is better or worse or not. We do that with these different shoulders of different lengths so that we can get a different amplification ratio. We can also change the stiffness of their neck. Again, bees are, maybe they could modulate that. We don't actually know for sure, but here the point is just we want to have the ability to have stiffnesses that are less than a typical bee. And if we add joints in parallel, we can get it to be similar or more than, or even basically infinitely stiff with a rigid piece across it. And then this is checking that we don't have too much deformation of those joints. So on the left, you'll see the actuators moving without the head. Then we attach this head on. It's still moving not too much less. And then if we block half of its motion, we get half the mandible motion. The thorax motion is not halved, but the whole device is shifting a little bit. So we think it's not too bad. Better than the other version. And then we can start testing. Next slide. Yeah, testing them more thoroughly. Another aspect we want to look at is where is the center of rotation of the head. This again is something a bee doesn't change, but we can control it by changing which of these actuators is moving and see how that compares with the center of the neck joint. And we think that will make a difference in how well it transfers vibration to the flower. Then we started, step by step, trying it with things more and more realistic. Here's a paper mock-up with the capiton joint mimicking the anther motion, and we're operating it here. If these are playing, yes, I think so. So it's sort of shaking the toothpick there. Go to the next slide. Right, okay, and then like a plastic flower, and it's also, hopefully, yeah, there we go, shaking that in a way, it shakes the whole flower like the way you can see in some of the videos with the bee. And then this is a real flower, but not buzz-pollinated, just one that my postdoc happened to have on hand. And, well, this may play, or this one. So here it's mounted with its little wire legs sitting on the flower, which is what we want to go with it, not held with the tweezers. We want to have the same boundary conditions we'd have with the real bee. So there it is, I think, shaking that. And I think well, eventually we'll get the next slide. It didn't click. I think that will be where I'll end. And I just wanted to thank you all for having me, and thank you to HFSP for funding this grant. And we look forward to getting more results in the remaining months of our funding and beyond. And I'm happy to take any questions.